Thank you. So I'd like to apologise in advance for not being with you in person. I had a cycling accident and I got a concussion, which affected my travel plans. So always wear a helmet. Anyway, I'm doing better, but once again I apologise for not being there. So last year I gave a presentation on the criminalization of activism at IARC in Luxembourg, and I was asked to give a similar presentation this year in Copenhagen. Taking a look around at today's activism landscape paints a bleak picture. Obviously I'm sure many of you are aware of Paul Watson, who is facing 15 years in prison in Japan after being arrested in Greenland. In July, climate activists in the UK were sentenced to 4 and 5-year prison terms for attending a Zoom call planning a non-violent protest. In August, activists were held for days under the Terrorism Act for damaging a weapons factory which was being used to manufacture missiles to be used against Palestinians. And only this week, the co-founder of Palestine Action has been detained under the Terrorism Act for giving 2 speeches which were alleged to encourage criminal activity. It appears to have been a prescient topic. It also appears to now be a risky endeavour to either attend a Zoom call or to give a speech. Seeing as I'm doing both today, please wish me luck. So I speak as someone who has already been imprisoned once before for my activism. So I'm very aware of the power that our words and actions hold, and the incentive our governments have to silence our dissent. But dissent we must, because if we don't fight, we've already lost. So a bit about me. When I was 18 years old, I attended my first anti-vivisection protest since moving to the UK. It was against a courier company who were providing delivery services to Europe's largest animal research laboratory called Huntingdon Life Sciences. Now, as some of you may have guessed from the concussion story, I don't tend to have the best luck in life. Within less than an hour, we'd all been arrested. However, on this occasion, luck had nothing to do with it. Years of industry lobbying had changed the political landscape in the UK and successfully eroded our right to protest. It transpired that week, the delivery company had just recently bought an injunction in the British courts that limited how often activists could protest outside their facilities, how close we were allowed to be, and how many people could attend that protest. I had never been served this injunction before, but the police decided I ought to have known about it, and was or covered by it by virtue of me being an anti-vivisection campaigner. They took us all down to a police station, held us for hours, took our DNA, and fingerprinted us, and then released us in the early hours of the morning on police bail. But we had to attend the police station every few months for over a year, until they finally decided to drop the charges. This entire episode struck me as something like from a dystopian film. I'd naively believed that there were certain rights enshrined in the British law, the right to protest being one of them. However, here I was being treated like a criminal for exercising that right. And I think that what disturbed me was that nobody really seemed to care. Being ripped off the street, forced into a car, and locked in a cell for 12 hours is an intimidating experience for anyone, but there's something particularly insidious about the state doing it to non-violent protesters. Without protest, we wouldn't have the rights we have today. We wouldn't have the right to vote, the 8-hour day, the weekend, or even equal pay. All the most important rights we have were won by protests. One part of our education system suggests that they've been handed down to us by benevolent kings and queens, but the reality is that the rights we have today have come about through rigorous, exciting, and difficult protests. People have committed themselves over many years to radical protests in order to win these rights. Take one example, the suffragettes. It never ceases to amaze me to hear our politicians venerating suffragettes who fought for many years for the right of women to vote. Over 1,000 suffragettes went to prison for the cause. Women never would have won the right to vote if the suffragettes had not fought for those rights. And yet nowadays, activist movements that follow in the spirit of the suffragettes face ever harsher consequences. In fact, looking at the suffragette campaign, today's current protest movements look positively tame in comparison. The suffragettes engaged in window-smashing campaigns under the slogan, "Rather broken windows than broken promises." They targeted infrastructure and government with improvised explosive devices, arson, vandalism, and letter bombs. At least 4 people were killed throughout their campaign. It might surprise many people to hear that the longest prison sentence handed down to a suffragette was 3 months. And yet now compare that to the sentences that activists face today. 5 years for attending a Zoom call, organising a peaceful protest. 4 years for blocking the motorway. And I think that's why it's so terrifying to see the extent to which today's governments are cracking down on protest. Because if they succeed, how will we ever win more rights? And perhaps that's the point, to stop us ever having more rights. That seemed to have been the state's intention when they arrested me on that summer's day in 2006, to intimidate us all into inaction. And to get away with their intimidation because by that point, the successfully branded anti-vivisection campaigners as terrorists, thugs, and criminals. And I'm going to talk to you today more about how that narrative change led to my friends and I being sentenced to years in prison without so much as a whimper of concern from the mainstream media or even human rights organisations. Today, few people will have ever heard of the campaign went to prison for. And in part that's because of how successful the repression was against the movement, as it essentially silenced an entire generation of activists, and the severity of that repression was largely driven by how successful the campaign was. That terrified an entire movement into pressuring the government into redrafting laws and imprisoning protesters. So after my first time being arrested, I made a deliberate choice to refuse to allow myself to give in to my fears, and instead decided to put off my university plans and dedicate all of my time to the SHAC campaign to shut down this animal research facility. The SHAC campaign stands for Stop Huntingdon Animal Cruelty. SHAC was formed in 1999 with one goal, to close down an animal research facility called Huntingdon Life Sciences, and the activists who formed SHAC had successfully shut down 2 companies that were breeding animals for the vivisection industry, Punthorpe and Hillgrove, before they turned their sights to Huntingdon Life Sciences, who were killing 500 animals every single day. Huntingdon Life Sciences were a contract research laboratory, meaning they'd undertake any research for anyone who'd pay them. This meant they'd be testing anything from pharmaceutical products to oven cleaners to artificial sweeteners to pesticides. People local to the lab used to call it the local poisoning factory. An undercover documentary had recently exposed the most horrific animal abuse inside the facility. I wish I could say that the government had done its duty and closed down the laboratory, but of course it didn't play out that way, and activists had taken matters into their own hands, kick-starting a global campaign to shut down the lab. The first time I saw the video footage filmed inside Huntingdon Life Sciences, I couldn't stop trembling. The tears wouldn't stop falling down my cheeks as I bore witness the absolute misery that is the life of every single animal locked away inside a laboratory, behind barbed wire fences, closed doors, and hidden behind soundproof doors. As I watched workers shake puppies by the scruff of their neck and punch them in the face for having veins which were too small to be easily injected, as I saw puppies having tubes violently shoved down their throats and poisons poured into their stomachs, so that they would drool, spasm, vomit, and finally die alone on the floor of their lonely cages, I made a promise to those animals that I would do everything within my power to end the abuse. It was a promise that would shortly lead me to a prison cell. If we witnessed someone forcing weed killer down a dog's throat directly in front of us, most of us would intervene. We couldn't not intervene. We would be horrified and would most likely do whatever was necessary to stop that dog from being poisoned, because to look away would be to acquiesce to their abuse. So why is it that as a society we can so easily ignore what happens to animals when it occurs out of sight? Animals in laboratories can legally be poisoned with toxic chemicals, shot, irradiated, gassed, blown up, drowned, stabbed, burned, starved, restrained to the point where they develop ulcers or heart failure, have their bones broken, limbs amputated, genitals mutilated, be subjected to inescapable electrical shocks, sickened with cancers, driven to depression, deprived of sleep to the point of brain damage, infected with diseases, and more. The stuff of our nightmares is the daily reality for animals in laboratories. As long as we do it in the name of scientific discovery, we can become monsters and claim our actions as science. When and why as a society, or as individuals, we stop caring about what happens to another sentient being? How many razor wire fences must we construct around them before we can ignore their suffering? And can we ever truly be distant enough that we can shrug our shoulders at their fate? The SHAC campaign decided early on that standing outside the laboratory every day, shouting through megaphones, wasn't going to close down the facility. Instead, the organisation decided that we were going to target the companies who were dealing with hunting and life sciences and demand that they did best in the lab. The companies who hunted in life sciences needed to survive, but the companies didn't need hunting in life sciences. That meant targeting its service providers, such as its banks, its investors, its shareholders, its suppliers, the people who were supplying them with cages or catering and even their toilet paper, and the customers of hunting and life sciences, the massive multi-billion-dollar pharmaceutical and agricultural companies who were paying hunting and life sciences to do their dirty work for them. Anyone and everyone was involved in the campaign to close down HLS. While SHAC targeted the laboratory with an above-ground campaign, the Animal Liberation Front and other groups targeted the lab using underground tactics, and in all a range of tactics were used by a movement united in its desire to shut down the lab, involving both legal and illegal direct action, from protests and office occupations to rooftop demos, criminal sabotage and animal liberations. Unsurprisingly, very shortly, the SHAC campaign made a lot of enemies. SHAC had made things personal. While often companies hide behind glass facades, the truth is that every company is made up of people making the decisions, and it's those decision makers that SHAC had been determined to reach. This meant rooftop demonstrations at the homes of CEOs. People were camped out in their gardens, swimming in their swimming pools, climbing on their roofs, protesting outside their golf clubs, and even disrupting their ballets. SHAC had made things personal, and those people began to feel the heat. Hundreds of companies severed their ties to hunting and life sciences over the years, including the world's largest bank and the world's largest insurance provider. SHAC had identified the cracks in the system, that these companies are not invincible, and soon these powerful interests began to band together to put pressure on the government to dismantle the campaign. Pharmaceutical companies began to threaten the British government that unless the government took action against activists, they'd leave the UK, costing the British economy billions, and a concerted effort began to shift public support away from anti-vivisection and activists. A movement which emerged out of a single desire to end violence to all sentient beings found its activists painted as the violent ones. After being lobbied by Big Pharma, politicians began to conflate non-violent animal rights activism with terrorism. In 2005, in the height of the War on Terror, the ruling Labour Party introduced the Serious Organised Crime and Peace Act 2005, which received press coverage for restricting the right to protest outside the British Parliament. What largely went under the radar was Section 145 of the Act, which made it a criminal offence to interfere with the contractual relationship of an animal testing facility. It meant that protesting in a way that created any form of public nuisance to an animal research facility was now punishable by a term of 5 years imprisonment. Bit by bit, non-violent activists belonging to different anti-vivisection groups soon found themselves being banned from activism and hauled before the courts for nothing more than leading effective protest campaigns. For years in the lead-up to our arrests, media articles, documentaries, and even soap operas had shifted the narrative away from the cause towards portraying animal rights activists as irrational and dangerous fanatics. In 2007, the BBC's Casualty Hospital drama series dedicated 3 whole episodes to a fictional animal rights bombing campaign. Lobbying groups lobbied press, politicians, and human rights groups, and the dialogue shifted once again from activists to terrorists. Undercover police and corporate spies were implanted in the SHAC campaign and the other anti-vivisection organisations who acted as agent provocateurs, manufacturing evidence which would later be used to imprison many of us. Like what we are seeing now play out against all activists in the UK, lawful protest tactics were criminalised. Because the authorities couldn't go after underground organising, the screws tightened on the above-ground organisers. And so it's in this environment that I decided it would be a great time to join the animal rights movement. And 10 months later, I was awoken to the sound of glass smashing downstairs, the sound of officers' boots running up my stairs, and the shouts of "Please, please," as they violently kicked down my door and dragged me from my bed. It would be the start of a nightmare, but I wasn't dreaming. I was told I was facing 3 separate charges, carrying a total of 24 years in prison. 2 of those charges were under the recently introduced SOCPA legislation. The other charge was for conspiracy to blackmail. I can say hand on heart that I do not believe I've ever conspired to blackmail anyone in my life. However, this was the eventual charge that I was tried for, and the one which I was subsequently sentenced to prison for. Blackmail entails making an unwarranted demand with menaces. The prosecution claimed that our demand, asking companies to divest their business dealings from the laboratory, was unwarranted because the laboratory was licensed by the government. So in their eyes, there was nothing wrong with what they were doing. According to the government, we have no right to ask a company to conduct their business more ethically. The menace was that if companies didn't cease trading with the lab, they'd be listed on our campaign website, and as a result, subjected to a range of protest activities and tactics, whether lawful or otherwise. After 2 years awaiting trial, during which time I was banned from protesting lawfully against the laboratory or from speaking with my friends and fellow campaigners. After a 3-month-long trial, during which time the press gleefully published stories about hoax bombs and threatening letters with the implication that we were somehow responsible for them, I was finally sentenced to 4 years in a young offenders institution. That day I received the shortest prison sentence. My co-defendants were sentenced to up to 11 years, and once again nobody seemed to care. Because as far as anyone was concerned, this hadn't been an assault on protest, but an important response to organised criminality. Even today, with the sentencing of Just Stop Oil protesters to 4 and 5 year prison sentences, many are saying the sentences are the longest handed out to non-violent protesters. In actual fact, the longest sentence was handed out to my co-defendant, Heather Nicholson, who was sentenced to 11 years for organising and co-founding the non-violent SHAC campaign. And this is what happens when we turn our backs on one another. Fascism doesn't just happen overnight. It starts with a creeping assault in certain sections of our society. It sows division and hatred, and it pits people against one another. So what can we do? We can choose to question the stories we are told, and why we are being told them. We can create community with one another and support each other when one of us is being unfairly targeted. We can stand strong together and refuse to allow them to separate us. We can choose to love over hate, and we can choose to take a stand against the criminalization of activism. Sometimes I hear them saying that you can't arrest an entire movement. From bitter experience, I've learned that they don't need to. They target the leaders and the organisers, and they take them out just long enough to instill fear in the rest of the movement that anyone else could be next. So we can choose bravery too. Bravery to stand up for what we know to be right, and to resist what we know to be wrong. We are now seeing what played out against the anti-vivisection movement play out against a wide range of activist movements across the UK and around the world, and similar tactics used in order to do so. Denoting peaceful activists as terrorists aims to paint us as aggressive enemies of the state, and it shifts the debate away from our legitimate demands. When we were in prison, the rhetoric from the police was that their prosecutions were not targeting so-called legitimate animal welfare campaigners. But when the state gets to decide what forms of activism are legitimate or not, we are in dangerous times. When the state gets to decide what is or isn't a legitimate demand, no matter what our political views, we should all be afraid. Throughout the world, we are seeing activists be rebranded as criminals and terrorists in an attempt to sway the court of public opinion away from us. But while our prisons are filling with activists, I ask the question, when will they raid the headquarters of the animal agriculture companies who are complicit in the destruction of our planet? When will they seize the ill-gotten gains of the fossil fuel companies and banks who are making money off the backs of our future? And when will the CEOs and engineers of weapon manufacturers like Elbit Systems, who conspire to murder Palestinians, when will they be put on trial for conspiracy to murder? And why is it that the people who try to make our world a kinder, fairer place find ourselves risking the gravest of consequences, while those who profit from planetary destruction and death get wined and dined by government officials? I don't have all the answers, but I know it stings. And I know that unless we find the courage to stand up in the face of repression, that nothing will ever change. These repressive laws are designed to scare the hell out of us, to terrorize activists into action. Why are they charging protesters with terrorism? Because they want to silence people. They do not want people to challenge the status quo where profits come at the expense of all of us, human and non-human alike. At the time of our prosecution, social media was in its infancy. Unable to broadcast our own messaging, the SHAC campaign had embraced an all media is good media ideology. When the press had reported that we were criminals, thugs and terrorists, We had done little to counteract the messaging, which ultimately had enabled the repression which followed. Government and industry conspired to crush the SHAC campaign, and it breaks my heart that they succeeded in terrorising an entire movement into silence. The SHAC campaign was a niche issue, a campaign run by vegans who at the time of prosecution were still considered to be rather weird. When the state came for us, few people paid notice because it didn't affect them. When animal rights activists were sentenced to years in prison, few people dug further into the story, believing the media lies and government and industry propaganda that such people were frightening criminals who needed to be stopped for the good of society. Last year, I expressed optimism that the same tactics that had been used to imprison activists in the past would not be as successful against current-day movements. I'm not sure whether I can say I still hold on to that hope. Now that repressive legislation is targeting those speaking up for a livable future, there are thankfully sections of the press who are far more sympathetic than they ever were to us. Newspapers and journalists are rightfully calling out the dangers of the legislation that governments are passing and speaking up for the activists being imprisoned under it. Human rights organisations and even the United Nations have spoken out against criminalization and targeting of activists. Lawyers have signed pledges informing the judiciary that they will not be complicit in prosecuting climate activists. Solidarity in the face of injustice is a powerful thing. The authorities got away with the repression of animal rights activists, largely because of the inequality that plagues our society. By understanding that all oppression is tied together, we stand a better chance of defending ourselves against a government that protects corporate interests over lives. The powers that be targeted the SHAC campaign largely because they could get away with it. For years, it isolated us and eroded public support. And I think that's why it's so important that we consistently support each other, because we do not have to agree with every tactical goal of every social justice movement. But when someone stands up to injustice and faces the wrath of the state, I think it's so important to remember the words of Angela Davis. If they come for me in the morning, they will come for you in the night. When we can recognize that we share the same goal, a dream of a kinder world, we can find the strength to stand shoulder to shoulder with those who need our unwavering support and solidarity. And yet, despite this display of solidarity, activists are still being imprisoned, and protest movements are still finding themselves in the firing line. I'm not really sure what the message of this talk is. I suppose I just want to say that if you look around, it all looks fairly terrifying. Talking of politicians adoring protesters of the past while hating current-day activists, there is a statue dedicated to a famous suffragette outside the British Parliament with the inscription, "Courage calls to courage everywhere." I suppose my talk here today is to say that although it may be scary, we are in good company. We stand on the backs of people who have fought with everything they have, who have risked everything they have, and who in many cases have lost their lives for the sake of freedom and justice. I'm not going to lie to you and say that prison isn't hard. Prison is a violent and abusive institution, and I hope that none of you ever end up there. However, I also know that our governments imprison those who challenge the status quo. And I know how important it is for all of us to upset that status quo. We can survive prison. Unpleasant though it is, we can survive state repression. I speak as someone who has come out of it, broken, but alive. Meanwhile, the animals don't survive. They die in their billions, in prisons that are more violent than any human prison. When I was arrested on May the 1st in 2007, alongside the founders of the SHAC campaign and banned from any further lawful protesting against hunting and life sciences, two young activists who had been raided and arrested that day too, but not charged, took over running the SHAC campaign in our absence. Their story is not a happy one. Frustrated that the SHAC campaign was still continuing, the authorities subjected them to two further raids, more undercover police spies, and until they eventually also found themselves imprisoned for years on trumped-up charges, and alongside us, subjected to all the cruelty that the so-called justice system subjects people to. Unlike those of us who had been charged that day, they had had the chance to back out. They could have distanced themselves from this movement, like many others had. But I know that had never truly been an option for them. They had witnessed their friends and comrades taken down in violent crackdowns, and they knew as well as any of us did what it was all for. They had heard the cries of those dogs locked up inside facilities like hunting and life sciences, awaiting torture and certain death. They had seen the most heinous animal abuse that anywhere outside of a lab would be illegal and seen for the barbarism it is. And they couldn't turn their backs on that. And they didn't. They threw themselves into continuing on the campaign, knowing what awaited them, knowing they were likely to face the same treatment until it inevitably happened and they too were locked up and prevented from fighting any further. And I think this is where I find hope, is knowing that there are people out there who fight with all of their hearts for what is right, who put in the work even when they know that the most terrifying consequences await them, because it's the right thing to do. I hope that all of us can continue to find that same strength to fight for justice, because it's the only way that we are ever going to achieve it, by the actions of the people who refuse to remain silent, who refuse to be intimidated into inaction, and who never stop fighting for change. And I find hope too in seeing activists today picking up the baton and taking on the vivisection industry in new and inspirational ways. My heart could have burst when I saw the photos of the beagle puppies liberated from certain death by animal raising from NVR acres. I hold on to the fact that we have so much more power than we sometimes think we do. I hold on to my friends and fellow activists who I love with my entire being. Every activist fighting for a better world is the purest reminder that goodness exists in this world, and that love will always be stronger than any prison bars can ever wish to be. I hold fiercely to love, in a world that so often feels devoid of it. It's a form of rebellion. It's resistance in a world that seems to value coolness above caring, indifference above interest, and apathy over concern. Life shapes us, sometimes in ways that hardens us, other times in ways that breaks us, sometimes in ways that soften us. We are all of us just riding this wave called life in the only way we know how. We might not be able to stop all of the injustices in this world, but we can choose to love. When it's hard and we don't want to love anymore, we can try to love harder. And I think this is how I try to survive this world, by never allowing it to take away that love. I hope that love, in all of its radical power, can save us. So let's look out for one another and hold each other up in a world designed to make us quit. The only thing worse than the consequences of taking action is looking back and knowing you should have done something, but didn't. Thank you.